to finish up here with our sea otter and why it is a keystone species. Again, the sea otter eats sea urchins, and in doing so maintains the health of the kelp forest off the coast. And in doing so, the kelp forest helps provide habitat and nursery for a multitude of fishes and crabs and all sorts of organisms. And then without the sea otter, the community structure declines greatly, basically falls apart, and the kelp will eventually disappear. So the abundance of the sea urchins again result in the loss of the kelp forests and the rich diversity of the sea life that was maintained by the kelp forest. So let's look at how disturbances affect communities. A disturbance is an event that will damage communities by destroying organisms outright and or altering the availability of resources that organisms need, like mineral resources, nutrients, and or water. And the type of disturbances can vary from a storm, fire, floods, droughts, even the felling of a large tree that just might be aged, termites, whatever, that can get knocked down and cause a disturbance in an established community. So small-scale disturbances can often have positive effects on a community. So, for example, a large tree fall will create openings, new habitat for saplings, young trees that would get the advantage of added sunlight to grow. In a thick forest, often the amount of sunlight that reaches the forest floor is very limited. So the opening in the canopy provides new opportunities and habitat for new members to grow and establish themselves in the community. Same thing with the fire. Can eliminate some competing species or highly competitive species and open up a habitat for species that might be weaker competitors. And in doing so, can increase actually the species diversity in an area. So people, by far, humans, are the most important causes or agents of ecological disturbance on the planet today. One consequence of that is the emergence of some previously unknown infectious diseases. Okay? Think of COVID-19 or SARS before that, or things like HIV. So about 75% of emerging diseases have jumped to humans, meaning that before human incursion into previously isolated areas, diseases were common or were limited to the organisms that were found there. And sometimes they were primates or monkeys, but when humans cause a disturbance, clear forests, and get closer to some of these animals, and actually maybe come into contact with some of these animals or hunt them and eat the meat, the pathogens, the diseases, the viruses have a ability now to be transmitted to humans. So we'll say sometimes that they jump species. And in doing so, the new host can be sometimes drastically affected by the disease and sometimes killed. So HIV that causes AIDS was likely transmitted to humans from hunting primates in Africa. And one leading idea is that the hunting of the primates was for meat. So eating meat that had the primate version of HIV. Then when it jumped to humans, it mutated and became the HIV that causes AIDS in humans. So hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola is another emergent disease that also jumped to humans from some point in Africa. And again, an example of how human disturbances has come back in a way to cause problems with humans. So let's talk about ecological succession. Communities can change drastically following some types of disturbances, especially if the disturbances are severe and they can actually strip away vegetation and or soil. Think of a massive fire or an avalanche, a hurricane, a mudslide, those type of events. So the diagram I have here shows on the far right an established community, and the community gets established from a starting situation that could theoretically be void of life, and colonizing species like lichens and photosynthetic bacteria would start the development and the production of soil. And as soon as you have little bits of soil, you can get some plants and grasses that can start to grow. And then as they die, they contribute to more soil accumulation, as you see here, soil accumulation. And as soon as you get enough soil, you get larger plants and bushes and shrubs that can grow. And you get richer new organic material in the soil. And that sets up a situation for larger plants, longer-lived plants, and larger plants to establish themselves. So there's a sequence of plant communities and organisms, plants first and then animals, that become established in a particular place. So it's a succession of organisms until you get to the most lasting, stable community. And this process is called ecological succession. And if you have some situation where all the vegetation and plant life and soil is stripped away, you get to the first successional step, as we'll talk about. So disturbed areas can be then colonized by a variety of species, gradually replaced by a series of different species in a process referred to as ecological succession. And again, this occurs whenever there's a severe, moderate, or drastic disturbance in an area. So let's talk about primary succession. This is succession and successional changes, or ecological succession, that begins in a lifeless area with no soil. So you might think of, well, how can that possibly happen? If you think of like the Hawaiian Islands or volcanic islands that are formed from molten lava coming to the surface, flowing across the surface and cooling, and that forms new land, which is essentially initially lifeless. Or a glacier that might be scouring through a mountain, and if the glacier retreats enough during the summer or climate change, what's left behind is just barren, eroded rock. So these is situations you have lifeless, soilless conditions where life can start to colonize. So when this occurs, we say it's primary succession, the first development of life in a barren place. So for example, the cooled lava flows, or the rock rubble left after a glacier has moved through. So what occurs is the colonizing pioneering species first show up, the things that don't need soil, like lichen and bacteria. Slow growing, takes a long time to establish themselves, but they will live, photosynthesize, die, start to produce a little organic material, soil. Over thousands of years, the simplest plants can start to appear, like mosses, and then larger plants like grasses, and then the soil accumulation process builds up. Then you have a mix of organisms. The community gets more and more advanced, up to the point where you have enough soil that larger plants and shrubs and trees can eventually appear. It's a slow process, but if you think of going to Hawaii and think of nice, luscious, tropical area of Hawaii with lots of vegetation, all of the Hawaiian Islands and many volcanic islands, or all of them, started out via primary succession. Secondary succession is a type of succession where there's an established community and there's a severe disturbance that knocks it back to an earlier successional stage. but not all the way to primary succession. So a severe fire knocks out many of the big trees, shrubs, plants, etc., but doesn't leave the place lifeless. There's still seeds, there's still shrubs, there's still roots that can regerminate, that sort of thing. The soil is left intact and living. So example, areas recovering from fires or floods. And then what will happen is there'll be a successional change of plants and organisms up until the established, long-lived community is in place. And then we say that things are fairly stable. Unless, again, there's some kind of severe disturbance. Okay, let's look at ecosystem ecology and the flow of energy and nutrients through ecosystem. So an ecosystem, as we've talked about before, community of species in a given area, all the different populations of organisms, and the abiotic components, like energy, sunlight, soil characteristics, minerals in the soil, water availability, temperature, right? The abiotic factors. So energy flow, passage of energy through components of an ecosystem. We've talked about earlier how energy flows through an ecosystem, captured by photosynthesis, and then when organic molecules are consumed via and broken down for energy harvesting and cellular respiration, some heat is lost. So energy flows through a system versus chemicals that cycle through a system. In this case, ecosystem. So chemical cycling is the use and reuse of chemical nutrients such as carbon and nitrogen within an ecosystem. For a certain period of time, the carbon and nitrogen and other elements are within the tissues of living things. Then when they die, decompose, decomposers will release those elements from organic molecules, and many of them will go into an inorganic form in the soil that can then be incorporated back into living things through the act of photosynthetic organisms like plants. So the chemicals will cycle through ecosystems versus energy that flows through ecosystems. So energy transformations. Again, way back early in the semester, we talked about how energy was required by all living things. And it's one of the characteristics of living things that living things can utilize and use energy for things like growth. You were small, now you're big. All right, packing on cells via mitosis. Maintenance of the organism as an adult, right? You're constantly replacing your cells, again, via mitosis. Reproduction, right? Cell production through meiosis for sexual reproduction, or reproduction of, say, bacteria through binary fission, right? All those cellular processes require energy. And for the things that can move, movement, locomotion takes energy. And all of these animals and plants, etc., the initial source of energy for essentially most everything on planet Earth is the sun, solar radiation. So, most solar energy is absorbed by the planet's surface, water, for example, or is scattered or reflected by the environment, by the atmosphere, and actually relatively a small amount of all the solar energy that hits the surface of the sun gets absorbed by photosynthetic plants. It's actually a really small percentage, about 1% of all of the light that reaches the surface of the planet is then absorbed by the photosynthetic organisms and is converted into energy, chemical energy via photosynthesis. Remember, photosynthesis creates sugars, and then the photosynthetic organisms, like plants, can make all of the other organic molecules, all stemming from the energy derived from sunlight via photosynthesis. But there's so much solar radiation that hits the surface of the planet, so much that only a little bit is used by all of photosynthetic organisms on Earth. But that's plenty. So then, what happens when the photosynthetic organisms are converting solar energy into chemical energy, into biological material for growth? and then consumers eat those things and they're able to grow.